Okay, so today is the
1st of March
2013. We're here at 400 George Street interviewing Fiona Gardiner, and interviewing you is Robert Riddel and myself, Janina Gosseye. So I think our first question is, what architecture qualifications did you gain and from which institutions?
Okay, well, I went to the University of Queensland, and I had the Bachelor of Design Studies and the Bachelor of Architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And you started in?
I started in 1972.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And who was teaching that you remember?
Well, Gareth Roberts was the professor, but he left in maybe the first, and in that it was still terms in those days, not semesters. He might have left after the first semester, and then Balwant Saini, there was a bit of an interregnum, and he came maybe later that year or maybe the next year. Mm-hmm. But the people that I remember, Bill Gregg was the lecturer who ran first year. Ian Cinnamon, I think Ian Cinnamon might have run second year when I was doing it. Bill Carr, and then there was a sort of all those Scottish people like Hamish Murison, and who else was there? Peter O'Gorman. I remember on the first day, one of my fellow students thought Peter O'Gorman was one of the fellow students, not a lecturer, you know. So he must have been young. Other people who were teaching, Stan Marcus Kyle, Graham DeGrucci, and so I remember them as the permanent staff, and then there was a lot of people used to come in, and sort of, who do I remember as the sort of the famous people who came in? Well, there's this wonderful structural engineer called Bernie Davis, so people have probably talked about him. So he used to come and, do you remember Bernie Davis? He and I'm not sure whether he's even still alive, and I think he was he might have worked at McWilliams or somewhere, and I think he might have, because I think he might have talked about Mr. McWilliam, but he taught structures, and he taught structures in a way that you could kind of understand it with, like, I think it should be about this big, or, you know, like he was very, he had a great personality. And then we had also Wilf Jews taught us specifications, and he was kind of a famous, he was actually Conrad and Gaga. He was a famous specification writer. And there were lots of other practicing architects popped in for various things over the course of the course, and the people that I remember, like I remember the first day we were up in the tower at UQ, because they didn't have the new building hadn't been built. I think the new building came maybe when I was in second or third year, so maybe 74 or something. So they were still in the tower, and also over in the social sciences building. In the first day in the tower, Blair Wilson was there. I think he might have been president of the Institute of Architects, and I can remember him showing a slide, because, you know, it was all very new then, you know, because people had been to space of the world, you know, looking back at the world from space and saying, kids, it's your oyster, sort of thing. So, but other people, I remember John Dalton. Everyone was crazy about John Dalton in those days. So he used to come and...
he was a bit of a superstar.
He was a well, and I think, you know, he was probably really at the height maybe then, because he was probably doing maybe the buildings over at Kelvin Grove, and, you know, and the houses were very well known and all that kind of stuff. So he used to come. Another one who used to come quite a lot, I remember, is Michael Bryce. You know, now and David Hunter used to come too, who worked for you. You remember David Hunter? Who worked for, he was probably a partner with Michael in those days, so he worked in Michael. So I don't know, they probably used to come and talk to us about graphics, and can't actually remember what but I have very clear memories of them coming. So there was a number of people came from the profession, would be invited from the profession.
And was Bill Carr?
Yeah, I'll talk about Bill Carr.
Somebody you didn't forget?
Yeah, I did mention him. He was he was there, but yeah. I mean, I thought I might talk a bit about Art Week. So, and Bill Carr's central to Art Week. So.
Okay, so that's coming.
That's coming. I don't know whether we do it now or
You can go ahead. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll do it in the next about what I remember about the curriculum content and quality and suitability.
What was Bill Carr teaching actually?
Bill Carr, I think he was big when he was big in my second year. I'll move on, but when I hit the course, it's the 1970s, 1972, the year before, so we've got the Vietnam War, we've got all the protests, and I'm not from Queensland, I was educated in Melbourne. 1971, a really big year on the campus of UQ with the Springboks and all that kind of stuff. So I suppose an energised student population, and the university was probably still quite small in those days. Like there was only 42 in my first year, and and the course itself had probably gone through a revolution, because when I was studying it was 3 years full time, a year off, and 2 years full time again. And I'm not sure of when it changed from being 3 years full time and 3 years part time, but sometime probably not too long before that they changed and probably reorganised to the 2 degrees and things. And they probably I was in the sort of, in a way, the course was terrible. They didn't teach you anything. And in some ways it was very good, because they taught, like, in a way they were reacting against everything in the sort of that had gone before. So I can remember seeing photos of a generation before, and they all had their white shirts and their ties on, and they were all sitting there, and they would have done lettering for a whole term or something. Like, so they didn't teach you to draw, or like, it probably were a generation that graduated without being very hard for people to employ, because we didn't come out with the kind of skills that people who had much more practical parts to their education did. And I think it's swung back. There's a little bit more balance. But I would, and I've been to a talk where Peter O'Gorman actually apologised about that, because they kind of almost said, well, we realised we didn't really teach you anything practical, but in some ways they let you. There was a lot of freedom, so people could really pursue things, and people have pursued, I suppose, interests that they had there that have been their passions for life and their directions.
That weren't architecture.
Well, that weren't and I mean the previous generations did that too, because in a way, if you were creative and you were going to university, what could you do? Architecture was the only creative thing. Like there wasn't
creative industries.
There wasn't creative industries and all those kind of things. So lots of, and people's parents probably thought, oh, you've got a very good mark, you must go to university, that kind of thing. So I think that attracted. So you had all those people of the generations before me who were in the architectural reviews and became filmmakers and artists and things like that. I suppose I'm thinking in my time, people spun off into computers. That computers were just starting, and in fact we had we did have some lessons about computers, which I don't know how I would have passed them, because I didn't know what they were about. But it was in the days when they had punch cards, and there was the whole ground floor of the steel building there was one computer at the UQ, and it took up like half a building or something. But there were some people who really got interested in that, and I think I did run into one of the fellows who was in my year, and he got a PhD in computers, and so they'd gone off that way. There was also a lot of interest in environmental things. So that was sort of so I suppose I didn't mention him before, but Steve Zoccolai came while I was at the school, so he was a huge influence on a number. Like, I'm quite friendly with Richard Sale, and Richard got very interested in environmental things right from, being at university, and I suppose it was a more maybe scientific interest than maybe previous generations had had, so they were measuring, things, and I'm not exactly sure what they were doing, but
Well,
so
Steve Zockerlake always was running programs like that.
Yeah, and so there were those kind of interests, and yes, I mean people did spin off into other creative things, or go off and become art teachers or filmmakers or something. But I think being right there when computers, the whole interest in computers and the whole interest in environmental design and science, I suppose. So when I say so in a way, said the course was, they didn't teach you anything, or they did teach you. Like when I was in first year, we had lots and lots of subjects. I remember there were lots and lots of subjects, and there were things like a subject we'd have and I don't know whether they went for such a long time ago now, but whether they went all term or they were just short bits of term, 4 weeks or something, or they were 1 or 2 lectures. But I do remember we had lectures in physiology, and we actually, the people who came and taught those, we had Professor Butzolson. He was the head of physiology. He came and talked to us in first year about physiology. So we were getting a very broad education. Sociology, Professor Weston, he would have been head of sociology. He came and talked to us. So there was that sort of, first year there was this amazing smorgasbord of stuff, I suppose, but we didn't sit down and draw or do lettering or anything like that. I think we go out and sketch by the lake occasionally, but I think one of the things that when I was in first year we had Art Week, and that was probably part of this smorgasbord of what they were giving. So rather than each Friday going and doing sketching or something like that, it was all squashed into this week, which I think might have been towards the maybe end of second term or something, near the end of second term, so August, September maybe. And they gave it to Bill Carr. Now, Bill Carr probably was a bit out of kilter with some of the other lecturers in the school, and they probably didn't know what to do with him, or or didn't fit in, or he didn't want to fit in. That would be for sure. And he organised Art Week, and I did jot down who I remembered being there, because. And I went, oh wow, because the people that he gathered were now sort of some of the most well-known artists in Australia, or they've all had amazing careers. So people like Gary Shedd, who's won the Archibald and all that kind of thing, and Tim Johnson, and he's quite a well-known artist now and from an architectural family, but at that stage he was probably a conceptual artist, and Albie Toms was there. So there's probably more that I can't. That's when I thought about who was there. That's what I could remember, and I remember Tim Johnson. So this week with all these I suppose radical artists coming to from, and they were from Sydney, coming to Brisbane, and the whole school did Art Week. So we all did Art Week, not just first year.
There was a College of Art by that time in Brisbane.
Yes,
Did they have any input into it?
Oh, I don't think so. Bill Carr probably would have thought that they were dreadful. I don't know.
Right.
And see, Bill Carr thought we were all very unsophisticated and naive, and probably we all needed to be, and this was all through the things that he taught us. We needed to be shocked and everything, and
were you shocked?
Was I shocked at? Well, I kind of I was expecting university to be not like school. Was I shocked? No, I sort of just took. I was thinking, well, this is what university's meant to be like, you know. But there was a session. So Tim Johnson was a conceptual artist, and at that stage he used to do things like he rearranged people's clothes or partly undressed them, and I think that there would be time-lapse photography going, and there was this, and I was actually there. It was we were in the Mickey building upstairs, because we had must have had a studio up there, and it was in one of the rooms up there, and it was night, and he was doing one of these performances, and it was dark, and then the strobes were coming on, I think, and his wife, whose name I can't remember, she worked with him, so he was rearranging her and rearranging her clothes and things, and that's when Bill Gregg and some others stormed in, and I think and I was trying to think about this, I don't think there was police, but there was definitely probably the university security thing, and the whole thing was stopped. So Art Week was closed down, and this became a great cause célèbre. Some of the students, I wasn't one of those, but they actually went with the artists. I think they moved Art Week to Mount Tambourine and finished it off. So they went off. I don't know whose place they went to or anything, but it was in the paper. There were questions in Parliament, I think, about it. I don't know whether the Vice Squad was involved, because we would have had one of those by then. Bill Carr got hauled up to some, like the Senate. The university would have. He would have been, an inquiry or disciplined, or.
Do you think he was set up? I mean, to run Art Week so that they could attack him?
No, I think he probably wanted to, shake everyone up.
Okay. And he did.
And he did. Yeah. It was in the newspapers. It even was in I remember one of my relatives rang my mother because it was in a Southern paper and things like that. And it led to, there was even as it went after, because Bill Carr's wife actually took a defamation case against the newspapers because of the way it was written up, and various people were witnesses in that. Like, I think Don Watson was one of the witnesses for Bill Carr, as was Quentin Bryce, sort of thing. So it was a really caused a huge, it was probably the most exciting thing that had happened for a while in the architecture school.
But how long had Art Week been going when it was shut down?
I reckon it must have been Wednesday.
So 3 days.
3 days. Because it started off, the first day was, you went to, the university owned that lovely Masonic temple down in Ellis Street. Do you remember the Masonic temple in Ellis Street? And there was some sessions down there, and we went running around the town. And we must have, I think it would have been about the middle of the week, the Wednesday night, by the time they were, because it was all to.
And how was it organized? Was it the idea that the students got workshops, or were there just artists doing their thing that you were looking at, or were you involved?
They were doing their thing, but we were also participating in things, and we were participating in conceptual things, and I remember we were photographing. We were running around photographing things, and so I think they involved us in in conceptual things, but I cannot remember us sitting there sketching during it. I don't think there was any of that.
Okay. And who you said there were 42 students when you started in the first year, and did they all go through, or how many did you end up with? And
so
do you remember?
42, 7 women, 3 women graduated, and by I think 28 might have graduated out of the whole course. I might be slightly wrong on that, but because people sometimes fall back a year, and end up take longer out or something. But yeah, as I said, 7 women in the first year. By the second year, 3 of those had left after the first year and gone off to do other things, to art college and things they didn't. And I suppose there was no women on the staff, no women lecturers, tutors, anything in those days.
So the 4 that were left were who? It'd take me a while to think of them. I know one went to art college and became an art teacher. They went and did other things, but I can't remember they haven't sort of stayed in touch. But the ones who did stay.
Yes.
And you'd remember those?
Oh, yeah.
The graduates. Who were those 4 graduates?
3.
3.
I think.
And you?
Well, myself.
Yes.
No, it's 3 graduates. Myself, Helen Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
And Catherine Ferrier. Yeah. And so we were unusual. That might have been the largest number of women into first year ever in the history of the course, because as we were talking before, they were like the year ahead had only one female student, and that was Catherine Brower. And then the year ahead might have had a couple, and then there was Margie Tong and Helen Josephson, the famous pair. So they were there tended to be 1 or 2 or 3, but that was the most that had ever been in first year. So that was, and of course probably by the time I was finishing year, looking back at first year, the numbers were starting to change dramatically in the balance of the genders in the course. And it was quite sexist, to be honest. I mean, I've talked to those, we're still very friendly, those 3 women who graduated, and we have talked about it, and we kind of can't believe that we put up with it, and what, the treatment that we had, and we don't think women today would do that, would put up with it. But so we were quite patronised, and because I don't think you were expected to, you were probably just there filling in time, so you weren't actually going to probably ever work for the rest of your life or anything, because you'd get married and, all that kind of thing. And I can remember one of the lecturers said to me, "Oh, well, you could go and become a colour consultant." So they that's the kind of thing that they they thought that that you weren't really serious or something like that. So.
So was history taught?
Was history taught? The person who was interested in history was Ian Cinnamon, who everyone really adored Ian Cinnamon. He was someone you really looked up to. He was the only one who maybe taught a little bit about local and Australian. You used to see thousands of slides, and because they all had wonderful slide collections, and so they'd all been on overseas trips, and everyone had gone. So you used to see lots of slides of European buildings and America and things like that. So history was kind of taught in that way.
But Ian had slides of Australia.
Well, I suppose Ian was interested in Karl Langer by that stage, probably. So Ian probably talked a little bit more about Australia. But there was no, like they have now, there was no sort of study of the local or anything. And and I suppose I'd come from a different place, and I actually thought, oh, Brisbane is amazing, it's so hilly, and there's all that, because Melbourne's not hilly, and there's all these houses on stilts, and so I in a way, I was interested in what was around me, because I'd come from another place and not grown up with it, and it seemed sort of so exotic. And when I'm talking about the course and saying that you could actually pursue things that you're interested in, and I suppose my interest in history and and conservation and everything came from being a student in those days, and getting interested in. I was Helen Wilson, my friend. We got very interested when over in South Brisbane there was a gasworks that on the river there, a sort of amazing brick building, and it was about to be demolished, and so that was in third year, 1974, and we sort of had this little campaign to try and actually stop its demolition, and we were actually allowed to do that as a project. And we wanted it, and when I think about it now, we wanted to actually turn it into industrial museum, and we were in the Australian and we were on TV and all that kind of stuff. So, but we were encouraged by our lecturer Stan Marcus Kyle, who's the father of Peter Marcus Kyle. I can remember he came because we did a report and all this. That would have been what we got assessed on. But we went around to, he came with us to see the director of the Queensland Museum, Alan Bartholomew, to try and sort of excite interest in the idea and everything. So there was a lot of freedom to pursue what you're interested in, and a lot of support in a way. When I think about it, thinking that Stan probably set up the meetings and all that kind of thing. So so interesting in that way.
But it didn't survive.
No, it got demolished.
Except for the stripping tower.
Yes, but it was wonderful, and there were hardly any of those gasworks. I think there's one in Tasmania, in Launceston, isn't there? But it's hardly any, and it would have been like the spaces were amazing. It would have been a fantastic, This is long before there were any powerhouse museums or anything like that. So they did give you a lot of freedom and support in some ways.
And what did you do during your year out?
Well, in my year out, everyone went travelling. Everyone went to Europe, and I think that was just in the era when overseas travel there was AUS, Australian Union of Student Travel Service. All of a sudden you could fly instead of go by boat. Did you go by boat or fly?
I flew.
Yeah, but
it was the second jumbo out of Brisbane.
Yeah, or something, But that before everyone had to go, so all of a sudden there was an explosion in going by plane, and there was a student travel service who, made it, cheap for people to go, and so, and there was a bit of a downturn probably in getting work there was probably a bit of 75, maybe a bit of a recession or something. So the opportunities to get work in architectural offices weren't that great. So a large number of my year went, went travelling and which I've still got drawers and drawers of the slides, and one day I probably should scan them all or something. It'd be interesting to look at them again and see what. But we went round and I went travelling with my friend Helen Wilson, and we went round and looked at Le Corbusier buildings, and we didn't go to Finland, but people went and looked at Aalto
and who would have made them aware of Aalto?
Well, it's probably people like Ian and Bill Carr and things like that. They would have, they all had their slide collections, which they'd all been and looked at things. We certainly and we went to America as well, and we went and looked at Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank, because everyone wanted to, so we went to Chicago and looked at all the Chicago buildings and things like that. So,
so when you decided to come to Brisbane, is that on your own, or did your family?
No,
move to
my
Brisbane?
family were moving, so there was a kind of I could make a decision about, because when I could have stayed, or because I was leaving school and going to university, and so I could have stayed or come. It was a, and I thought, oh no, I can't. It seemed like something different. So yeah, I decided to.
I mean, there were quite a few Melbourne people who finished up here, like Birrell and Dick Stringer.
Yeah, but they all came after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, there was this tradition, and there was also the feeling that there was a lot of stuff going on in Melbourne that was better. Did you encounter that or not?
Oh well, don't we feel that even now? Did I encounter? Well, I suppose when, I was interested in doing architecture when I was at school, and I'd been to you could go to Melbourne University open days, and Daryl Jackson would be talking and things like that. So, I suppose there was an interest in architecture, people were interested in architecture, I did art, and in art we did a bit of architectural history, and so we looked at Queen Anne buildings, and so we had a little bit of by just looking at what was around you, and I suppose in the course that thinking about the male and female students, the male students were a lot less well educated than the female students, because they'd all done technical drawing, whereas we'd done art, and so we probably knew a little bit more about the world and architecture than they did, because they'd just done technical drawing.
We used to do technical drawing at primary school, not at secondary school.
But there was, in my year, there's all these guys who'd done technical drawing as a subject to grade 12.
Okay. They must have been very good.
So that was a sort of and say my Catherine Ferrier had Betty Churcher as her art teacher. I'd had my art teacher, Mrs. French, was Leonard French's first wife. They'd been an art student with him. So they were sort of people who were very capable and
the Melbourne thing interests me because I think you said Brisbane was so exotic and different to Melbourne, and that made you aware of what was here in a way that it wasn't aware to people who'd grown up with it. And Dick Stringer, I think, had the same experience. That what is this fantastic wooden stuff?
Hilly and the wooden and the sound. The rain. The rain's amazing.
The smell of it, the vegetation. So that was a pretty potent kind of injection at a time when you were looking for where you were going. So probably moving to a different place has and made me interested in the place and the history of the place and what made it and everything.
But you said there wasn't really at the school this awareness yet of the
Well,
local.
I suppose it was, people like Ian were, he was, probably getting interested in Langer then, and so there were people. He was someone who was interested in it, and.
But Langer was pure European.
But he was transposed here, wasn't he? So, I'm saying that in being interested in something that was local, someone that wasn't, in Europe. The other thing, they all had a million slides of Japan too. They'd all been to Japan, and they'd all been to all the temples and the gardens, and so we all thought Japanese gardens were wonderful, and.
But you said that John Dalton was a superstar. How was his architecture regarded? Was it?
We probably thought it was just wonderful, and because he was, I suppose he was good looking and spoke well and all that kind of stuff, and all these, and I suppose all the interest in climate and all that kind of stuff, and it seems so modern what he was doing, and he was a superstar. In the notes that I made, the other thing thinking about the education and things that were sort of influential was the student conferences, and this is why I had to make the notes, because
you went to some?
I went to some. I went to 3. So in 1972 we went to Sunbury, And Sunbury is in Victoria outside Melbourne, and there was a sort of famous rock festival that used to happen at Sunbury, but I think it happened around Australia Day or in January or something. This must have been, my memory now, this must have been a little bit, because it wasn't that time of the year, because I hadn't started the course then. So it's later in the year, but it was at the same place where they had the rock festival, I think. And it was an architectural student conference, and it was probably quite influential on a number of people. Well, I remember very much that Barry McNeil spoke at it, and he was running the school in Hobart, and he actually influenced a number of students left the University of Queensland and went to Tasmania to study his course, as a result of seeing him at that conference.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the people who did that was Catherine Brower. So she I don't know whether she was in second year, so whether she went off in third year. I had a friend in one of the fourth woman, Anne Ruck. She went off to Tasmania. So I can think of, and it might have been more, 5 or 6 of them who so that was all from seeing, and I think that the course was more interesting. For the course was seen to be cutting edge. Well, we wouldn't have said cutting edge, but more interesting.
So he was talking about the course?
Yes, he would have, because that was a huge influence from that, when you think about it. I can think about, I can't remember all the names, but I can remember that guy in second year who was a friend of so-and-so.
Mm.
They all went, there was a real Queensland contingent in Hobart, and that all came from that. And the other people I remember speaking and at that one were John Andrews, Evan Walker, and I think Peter McIntyre, and for some reason I think Gough Whitlam might have been there, but and it was one of those ones where it was at where the where I think the pop festival must have been, because we all camped, but the people in the year ahead of me were very energetic group. And you've probably interviewed some of them, but they were the ones that got the bus, and like Bruce Wolfe was in that year, and they got the bus, and they were boyos, I'd call them, but they were very energetic, and like I can remember they made this amazing structure, which they took because they were great at making things and doing things, and they made this amazing structure, and which they took down and erected down there, which was sort of had some central thing, and then they all had like sleeping slots out of it. But it was made out of something incredibly heavy, so it was really heavy. But they made it and they took it down on a trailer down to Sunbury. And people would have made things to be there because it was the era, like everyone was there was probably Buckminster Fuller, and there were probably lots of domes there, and everyone had the whole Earth catalogue.
So what year is this?
This is 72.
So your second year?
First year.
First year?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I can remember going, so I did go, and I think I just, with some other people in first year, we just camped. We just had a tent. We hadn't sort of made these amazing structures or anything like that. But that was something that would have influenced a lot of people. That obviously the people that went to Tasmania, and then the next year, 1973, was Nimbin, and I actually googled a bit about this because because my year and this was prior to the Nimbin Aquarius Festival, which was run. I found out was when I looked it up. Was run by the Australian Union of Students. So at Easter time, we actually went to Nimbin. And as a project, we built some little bridges and things. So we worked on some of the infrastructure for what was then this sort of amazing festival, which must have been, after, a month later or something like that. Now, I didn't actually. Some of the students actually went to the actual festival. I didn't go probably because uni was on, and I would be I wouldn't miss uni or something and being too sort of good to think, oh no, you can't take time off. That's so a lot of people. So a number of our people from our school are involved in doing things there and going to the festival, and that seemed to. So I don't know whether the thing that we went to at Easter was like an architectural conference thing or. And then the next year, 74, there was a conference that was in Queensland, and it was an architectural one, and it was on a train, and it went from Brisbane to Mundubbera on a train, and stopping at various places, and I can remember being stopped in Merritt. So I don't know whether we slept on the train or we camped, or but I can certainly remember being in Maryborough, in Queen's Park, listening. I can't remember who spoke at it or anything like that, but I remember this train very, very vividly, and I think I must have been slightly involved in helping organise it or something, because because it was a UQQT combined thing, but it was a national one because I'm sure people came from all over the country. So, but I don't think I went to. I can't remember going to in the final 2 years going to any conferences, but they would have had them, but. So whether they were in places that were difficult to get to, or I just I don't remember going. I didn't go to any, but I remember those very, very bits of them quite vividly.
Okay. So,
were the reviews on in those days or not?
I think the reviews were over. Like there was no. I do remember once. And whether this was in first year, going to the Avalon Theatre, and there was something, and I remember Paul Memmott up the back working the projector or something, and there would be sort of psychedelic, maybe they had 2 projectors or something, or something going in and out or something, really, really fantastic. But no, the whole, that had all... it
was the previous era.
The previous era. And... probably the people who came as I said, so some of the people like the year ahead of me they were full of lots of energy, but it was a different type of energy. My year was a probably fairly quiet year. The year that came, not the next year was a bit quiet. Then the year when I was in third year, that was first year, so 1974 was the year that Peter Skinner and Libby Watson-Brown were in, and that's they were a very creative year. Like they kind of you look back and they were lots of musicians, and they had by that stage I think we were having probably barbecues on Friday with bands and things like that, and we probably moved into the new building by then. That's right. So we were down by the lake, the Student Association. But certainly that year of Peter and Libby was incredibly creative. They stood out that year, as a lot of energy, creative energy. They did lots of, that, and they're still, so that they still, a lot of those people still get together and be a band at things, at people's birthday parties and things, don't they?
You're talking the Corleones?
And by that stage we would have been at the architecture school by the lake, and so there was quite and probably why there was less student life in those, or different, was that we were spread in different places, so everyone wasn't together. So there was the tower, there was the Mickey building, and there was the bottom of social sciences. So it was very, and that's quite a lot of walking across. So people probably didn't interact as much. Once we got into the new building, there would have been, I just remember it was much more. There was a studio people were around there a lot, and people stayed there. There were the all-nighters and all that kind of thing. People stayed at university working on their projects like crazy and all that kind of thing. And that was of course the days there was no security or anything. Now they've all got swipe cards and all that kind of stuff. But so maybe it was a bit dispersed in the first couple of years because of the physical locations. But
and did Balsani have an impact on what was taught?
I don't really remember him having an impact on what was taught. No.
He'd come from Melbourne?
He'd come from Melbourne, and I'm trying to remember what his research was. His research interest climate or something? I mean, I think that the person who had the biggest in the climate thing obviously is Zoccolai. I mean, other people who were, when I was in first year, Paul Memmott was in final year, and actually Memmott and Bycroft, they were names that were said together in hushed tones too. And John Mainwaring was in that year. They were probably a star year, and they were very involved. I remember we all went out to John Mainwaring's place at Brookfield for the final party and all that kind of thing. They were very probably, they had lots of really very bright people in it, and they had a lot of energy too, I suppose. And then Paul and Peter Bycroft, I suppose, stayed on and did higher degrees, and by the time I was in the final year, they were, and this would be, when I look back, this is another, I did a subject that Paul ran maybe in final year, was on research methodology, and that's probably, because Paul was probably the most scholarly person at that stage to have come out of University of Queensland, and I don't know whether he was the first, he was the first person to get first class honours or something, and so it was actually a subject where you read architectural theories and things, but and it affected one of my friends from doing that work with Paul became very interested in the work of Bill Hillier in London, and that's gone completely in that direction, and that was probably that I'm thinking that research subject with Paul, where you actually had to do proper research and footnote things properly and all that kind of stuff, which you didn't have to do for anything else, was also something that I look back on and think, when I say that, I actually learnt a lot from that.
Mm-hmm. So did you work for any practices during your study?
Yes, in the holidays in first year, I worked at Jim Bill's office, and it was down in the valley, and that's where I met Russell Hall was working there, and so this was where I became a friend of Russell's. I'm trying to think out who was working there. And I'd never met anyone like Russell Hall before, I can tell you.
And Russell Hall gets to demolish the.
He demolished the gasworks. Yeah.
So he could actually get close to it and keep a few bits.
Yeah. Well, I actually do have some of the bricks still under my house. I've got a pile of bricks that I bought from Russell. They've carted around, but
Dick Stringer would have been working for Birrell then?
No, it was
Philip Conn?
Yes. Was he? Was he the partner? Did
Philip Conn, I think, might have been the partner.
It was
or in Laurie Cully.
Laurie Cully was, but the partnership was just breaking up. Bill, we were in a building in Ann Street.
Oh.
Upstairs, before you get to the pub, the Empire.
Okay.
Yeah, so between that and
somewhere near Lucky's, or on the other side.
The other side, yeah, towards All Hallows, and one of the things Bill must have I can remember I spent an awful lot of time measuring up what was then David Jones, I think, the Dodds building. Wasn't it David Jones?
T.C. Byrne.
T.C.
Oh, well, David Jones was in the T.C. Byrne building.
Yeah, well, by that stage it was David Jones. Yes. And he must, I think that must have been at the stage, maybe that David Jones was going to close down and maybe it was going to be arcaded or whatever happened. I don't know, so I can remember spending an enormous amount of time measuring up that building. But I suppose that's sort of the biggest, and Jim Bill I think he was having a sort of personal crisis at that stage because he didn't seem to be there very much. But certainly like Russell was the sort of the big personality there, and Jim Bill's daughter Anne she was working there. That's when Russell got, because Russell married Anne Bill.
Of course.
Yes. But they divorced. But so that was all happening then. So that was that kind of, and I think maybe Larry Canua worked there too. I'm trying to think who else was there.
But Don Watson wasn't.
Don wasn't. I hadn't met Don by that stage. No.
So which year is this? 70?
This is 72, 73.
Oh, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Okay. Because by 74, Don was working on that thing at the
but for
T.C.
someone
Byrne
else.
building for Geoffrey Parr.
Yeah, so Bill must have lost the...
It was John Roberts who developed it as Fashion Valley.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And Don's famous colour scheme emerged.
That's right, yeah. So so an awful lot of time was spent measuring up that building, and then in the next holidays, I worked at the Public Works Department, and probably the person who I must have worked for, because I seemed to be influential on me, was Peter Pastrooper. So I met Peter Pastrooper then. And I don't know whether people have talked about him in anything he's done, but so he was obviously maybe he was my boss because I work with Gary May, I remember, but Peter Pastrooper, I formed a friendship with him that continued on after that, and he I suppose we lived in the same suburb or something, but he was always took an interest in how I was going with my course and all that kind of thing.
So that was for all the rest of the years, 1974, 1975.
Yeah, and then we went overseas in the next year, and
did you work overseas?
But not in architecture, bars and au pairing and all that kind of thing. And then when I graduated, and it must have been still tough. Like everyone took a while to get a job, and so it might have taken a few months. I think I didn't get a job until April or something.
Of which year?
That'd be 78. And I was probably I actually got a job working for my friend's father. So I went to work for Ian Ferrier, and he had a big extension of a hospital. So he, but he didn't have his daughter didn't work there at that stage. She was working somewhere else. But so my sort of post-graduation work was working for Ian Ferrier, and he was extending the Holy Spirit Hospital at that stage. So, and I would have been doing cupboard details and bench details and all that kind of thing.
So while you were a student, which architects did you admire?
Well, Who did? Well, we you know, as I said, Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright and.
But what about here?
What about here? Who did we admire here? Well, I suppose because I'd been working in Birrell's office, I thought Birrell was pretty good, and because we had the buildings on the campus, and you know, we all thought, you know, Hartley Teakle's fantastic, and Union College, you know, because Union College was the most fashionable college on the campus. Like, people really wanted to get in there. You know, it was hard to get into and had the best building and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So Birrell was, you know, like, the coolest students went to Union College.
The coolest students went to work for Birrell.
and yeah, so, and probably, yeah, well, as I said, John Dalton would have been, because he came and talked, you know, lectured and everything. We were very influenced by him. I mean, everyone thought, say, La Boite Theatre, which Blair Wilson had probably just done in those days, was fantastic too. And I'm just thinking, I can remember, I was thinking about what we thought and how much the city has changed. I can remember being with Helen Wilson over at South Brisbane and looking back at the city, and this was maybe in first year or something, and there were only 2 high-rise. And it was the TNG, and then Conrad and Gargett had just done SGIO. And that was, I mean, there was obviously the buildings, earlier buildings that might be 8 stories or something, but, you know, there was only 2 high-rises, and you could see the city hall clock and all that kind of stuff. So probably the work that people were interested in was much smaller scale, in a way, like, they were influenced by people, the houses people were doing, or, you know, a small theatre, or, you know, the work architects were doing wasn't of the scale that people do now.
Well, did you know about people like John Railton? Were they
we knew about Pat Moroney, because. You know, and I think Gabriel Poole used to come and talk at the school, so we knew about we knew about Pat Moroney because he lived in Chelmer, and some of the other students lived in Chelmer, and, you know, they'd seen his houses and things. I don't think we knew about John Railton in those at that time, because would he have left Brisbane by then?
Well, he must have. Can't remember when he left Brisbane, but certainly before 1970 he'd done a handful of houses here.
Yeah.
And we'd been to his own house in Spring Hill, which was a sort of a pilgrimage you did.
Yeah, well, I don't remember, so whether he dropped from our sort of consciousness by that stage, like if he wasn't around, maybe if he wasn't coming out to the school or something, or if he wasn't getting published in Grace Garlick's column, or something, you know.
Yeah. Well, there's, I mean, Hayes and Scott were
and
active.
Yes,
and so was Curro Nutter Charlton.
Yes. Now, I think we were aware of Hayes and Scott, and I suppose because we were sort of that generation where people weren't working in offices in the way, you know, during the course in the way that, say, in the previous generation, you didn't have that thing of everyone, oh, so-and-so works at this office, or we didn't, and you know, they're working on this house or something. We didn't quite have that. But I'm thinking about, in the notes that I was thinking about, you know, when leaving university, then I worked, as I said, Mr. Ferrier. Then I worked at Blythe Jessup Bretonel, and for Mr. Bretonel, and I think we probably did banks or something. I was probably working on interiors. They probably, I don't know, was it that they might have had the ANZ Bank, or they had a bank client, and we were doing interiors or fit outs or something to banks. But that's when I kind of met John Voller, and Mr. Voller still worked there, and he was very scary.
Yes.
You didn't want to get into trouble from Mr. Voller. And Mr. Bligh Graham's father had retired, but Arthur, but he used to come in once a week or once a month or something, and he was this lovely old gentleman. And then I went to work at Conrad Gargett. Conrad and Gargett.
Yes.
And
which year is this?
This would be maybe 1980, and this is probably one of the things that pushed me in the way I've gone. I actually went to work on the we called it restoration of Parliament House, and their offices were in the SGIO in those days, but I was actually in a side office down at Parliament House for the time that I was working there, the 18 months or something. And Ian Charlton was the partner in charge. Don Winson was the project architect. We had our office. It was in one of the rooms along Alice Street, and Graham Young, who still works at Conrad and Gargett. I saw him coming in the building the other day. He was on the team. So there was a small team on that, and I think I stayed there for about 18 months, and by that stage that I had decided that I really wanted to do more about conservation, and I left there, and that's when I went to York. So I went to study at the University of York. And that was I was at York for 81-82 that academic year.
Which was the best place?
Well, it was the only place to go, wasn't it? Oh, you could do it at something at the AA, couldn't you?
Not in the same way.
Yeah, and the reason why I did that was Derek Lundstrom, who was the head of that course, had been on a tour around Australia probably a couple of years previous, and lectured, and he'd lectured in Sydney, Melbourne, and he'd been to Brisbane, and I'd been to his lectures, and so that sort of.
So when would that have happened? What year?
When he would have come, well, obviously before 81, it's going to be 79 or 80, and that's it was probably the National Trust maybe who would have been influential in bringing him out. I think it was like a British Council sponsored tour, but that's the height of you got the Bellevue, so very active. The National Trust's very active in those days. Peter Forrest, and the staff that they're getting. That's when Don Watson goes and works there, and Richard Allen goes and works there.
Bob Moore, did he work there too?
No, and I can remember Bob Moore was at uni when I was at uni. He might have been in the same year as Helen and Margie, I think. And I remember him, he was always interested in history and heritage buildings, and he went and did something, like he drew up Newstead House or something, I can remember he, as a student, he did, he was always interested, but he would have, he probably went and worked at the National Trust, but he went off to Sydney to work. Very soon he went to Sydney to work, and he worked in heritage in Sydney for the government initially. So he might have done a short stint at the National Trust, so I've sort of moved on. I talked about who I'd work for, and sort of how I got into heritage conservation, and thinking about who are the influential people on me and around in those days, and really Richard Allen. And I don't know whether you've interviewed Richard, but Richard in a way is, well, I suppose he left UQ, but that's a story in itself, isn't it? Went off to Melbourne, but you'd have to say, like, he was the intellectual leader, wasn't he? Of heritage conservation, and they were really making it up in a way. They like he was right there at the earliest days, went to the meeting where they decided to make the borough charter, and I suppose they were actually developing a practice and a profession.
Peter Forrest was probably very influential there, and Richard and him together, I think.
Yeah. See, I didn't know Peter Forrest as well. I actually, when I came back from York, I got in touch with Peter Forrest, and he was going to. He said, "Oh yes, I've got a job you can work on," but it was just at the time. He then left the National Trust in whatever circumstances they were, sort of unusual circumstances, or so that actually. So I didn't get to go and work with him at the National Trust on whatever project he had in mind. But so Richard. And I suppose that's when Richard then went off into start his own practice.
Mm-hmm. With Meredith. I'm not sure where Meredith came.
Well, Meredith worked at the National Trust, didn't she? She came. She's a planner, Meredith Walker. So she'd got a job at the National Trust, I think. And then when Peter Forrest left the National Trust, it probably all imploded a bit, and it had also there'd been quite a lot of money from the Commonwealth with, grants and things, and maybe that was starting to dry up a bit. And Richard and Meredith, they went off together? Were they in practice together?
Because I worked for them when I came back to Brisbane in '79.
And then, of course, Robert's one of the influential people in history and heritage too. Of course, I did work for, because by the time I was doing work with Richard Allen, he was his office was in the building that Robert owned, and you were upstairs or out the back. You were in some kind of cubbyhole out the back, weren't you?
Well,
you were like under the house.
I built myself an office behind his office, and then he said, "Oh, we need that." I had to go out.
You had to
build another one.
Oh, okay. So is that when you did you build the little cubby house, sort of the under the house then?
Yes.
So they were, I think Richard's really important in kind of intellectual. I think Peter Marcus Kyle is really important too. He then was working there and became a partner.
Yeah, they went into partnership. Meredith wasn't a partner. Meredith had her own practice, but she was there.
Yeah,
and together they were where it was happening.
Yeah, and really all the people who. A large number of people who work in heritage conservation have all been through these offices. So they've been through Richard Allen's office, or they've been through Bob's office. So they were the kind of the training grounds.
But their first practice was in Water Street.
That's right.
Shop.
I wasn't
where I started.
Yeah. By the time I was over in your building by that stage. And I suppose if I'm talking about the other person who's been a great influence on me is Don Watson, and I suppose I didn't actually get to meet Don, maybe because he wasn't at university. I mightn't have met him until about 1980, or maybe it wasn't after I came back from York. Because at that stage he would have been working at the National Trust on his Queensland house and everything. And so, and I've done various research projects and things with him, and I think, Don's just one of these, not only is he a encyclopedia of everything that's happened in architectural history in Queensland, with an amazing memory and interest and everything. He's a wonderful architect, just a fantastic architect. So he's a bit of a genius, I think. So they're the kind of people who have been influential.
Well, we get on to your architectural career.
Well, this is I've said all the offices I've worked in,
yes.
And I haven't really, because I haven't sort of practiced as a traditional architect, I can't say Mayumu, my most wonderful building is or anything. But,
well, we don't want you to say that. We want to know the story. So we've covered probably, I mean, you didn't start practicing as an architect per se. You were working for who first?
Well, it was Ian Ferrier.
Yes.
Then Bly, Jessup Brettonall,
yes.
And then Conrad and Gargett.
Yes.
And then I went and did
National Trust.
More study, and then I never actually worked for the National Trust. Then I came back and I did work for Richard Allen. I did research for you on I did work for myself. So I did little jobs for myself, and then I worked for these other, for Richard and Bob, and I did I suppose I did a job with Ian Cinnamon at the University of Queensland on Glengallen. So we did that first big conservation plan on Glengallen. I did that first work on 20th century architecture and that was for the Institute of Architects.
A seminal work.
It's sort of you're embarrassed when you look at it now, but that was in the early 80s, and in thinking, one of the questions, and I did travel around Queensland a lot looking at architecture, and one of the people who jumped out at me, who's in this period, was Eddie Orabin. I'd never heard of Eddie Orabin, and I saw that Proserpine church, and I saw the Mariba Hall, and I thought, who's this person? Where'd they come from? So he really, jumps out when you were looking at things in regional Queensland in the 80s. So so I suppose during the 80s I'm working for a number of different people doing, so the 20th century, if I'm thinking what are the big things, is the 20th century, the Glengallen conservation plan, some of the things in with Richard Allen, like I worked with Peter Marcus Kyle on the first conservation plan for the old museum. We did work on and that was when we were really working out what conservation plans were and how you did them.
They weren't really invented.
They weren't. We were inventing them, and I think I might have brought to Richard's office a little bit more research and rigour to the conservation plans. We did work at Nudgee at the orphanage, on the orphanage buildings. So there's some of the ones that kind of pop out. Are we running out of time?
This one is running out of memory space. I'll have to replace it in 3 minutes.
Okay. So that was sort of like, and I suppose that was in the 80s. There were lots of, like it was a contested time in Brisbane for heritage buildings, and when I say, in 1972 we're looking at the city and there's only 2 high-rise, well, then there was kind of devastation in a way. There was the city was remade, Eagle Street was totally remade, wasn't it? And so there was a lot of demolition. The National Trust was really very active. Like Bob was you were a councillor, weren't you, of the National Trust, and I was like the listings committee. I was on the listings committee, and that was an awful lot of people who work in the field now were on the listings had been on those committees, because that was another amazing training ground.
Well, we didn't have a Heritage Act here,
no,
and therefore we didn't have a government department, so it was all had to happen through the National Trust in a voluntary way. And these were times where you had to take sides.
And so you've had 79 is the demolition of the Bellevue, and then 82 was Cloudland. Like I think when I came, I'd just come back from overseas and they demolished Cloudland. when was the Regent Theatre? Because I remember getting very involved in the Save the Regent campaign, which was run by
Jack Kershaw
and David Hunter. Yeah, and so that might have been that was in
Must
the 70s.
Been 74.
No, it's later than that. It's more like 79 or 78, or I think. I think I'd finished university.
Oh, beg your pardon. Yes, it must be 79.
Yeah.
Because I can remember the Save the Regent poster that you had on your car.
Yes, and so you'd come back and they, so there was a lot of, and there was that huge concert, that last concert thing that they organised that was in the Regent Theatre, and they had the famous English actor who I think he might have been Steptoe or something. I can't remember the name, but they had some famous person who was sort of headlining this thing. It was all the Save the Regent people had organised it, and they they weren't totally successful because they didn't save the whole thing. But I don't think what remains would have remained if it hadn't been for the Save the Regent. So they say that the building that fronts Queen Street, which had the entrance and some offices above, it was a sort of little 4-storey building, and then there was a huge cinema theatre thing behind it. I don't think that.
Well, these last questions, the last 3 questions here were about sort of significant architects who have worked in your office, which isn't really applicable, but it is applicable in terms of where you are now and where you've found yourself in the department. I mean, you've worked with a lot of people in the course of that, so maybe you could talk about those. Well, maybe you already just have.
Well, I have in a way, sort of, I suppose, talking about Richard Allen and Peter Marcus Kyle and Robert, Don Watson, because in my career I was working for myself and working with other people and working on projects, and then in the very late 80s, 90s, I got an opportunity and I went to work at the Works Department, and that's how I came into government. And I went into what was called the Historic Buildings section then, and we were starting to work on actually to look at what heritage buildings the government owned and catalogue them and work out what to do with them. And probably from the thing that I feel stands out a bit for me in that period was I authored with Judith Mackay doing the historical research. We didn't call it a conservation management plan, but anyway,
a study
or something about Bogger Road Jail, and it was right at the time when they'd built a new prison. They were out on the outskirts. They were going to. They really wanted, and there'd been a big inquiry into prisons in Queensland, and Bogger Road was really seen as a sort of the symbol of everything was wrong in how people were treated and all that. And there was a big. Sort of, they thought that they would demolish it as well. They demolished the and this report actually, which we wrote, it wasn't. I don't think it was the Director General, but it was Mal Grierson took it home on the weekend, read it, said we're not demolishing it, and that was because there was no heritage legislation or anything like that. So that. Stands out to me as something that something that was influential in that period, and then from working in the Works Department in this was all in the period when there'd been lots of agitation by the National Trust. We need heritage legislation. There was a change of government after a very long period. Get Wayne Goss coming in, and he had a commitment to making heritage legislation. And so I came and worked in what the department that I'm still in, or it's changed its name about 10 times, but we're and in 1992 when the legislation started, so I came to work then, and so that's where I've been since.
Well, you've done the study of 20th century buildings along the way.
Yes.
Firstly, there's two questions here. Which buildings constructed in Queensland between 45 and 75 do you consider significant, either personally or generally? Now, you talked about Birrell.
Yeah, and seeing those Oregon ones which were in that study really, and that was before. I don't know that many people knew about. I mean, Rex Addison knew about Oregon, but I don't think that many people knew about Oregon. That's before anyone had done a thesis on him and things like that. Hayes and Scott, certainly in working on that 20th century work. I think Hayes and Scott are incredibly influential. I think the buildings, but also the people through their offices. Like everyone seems to have worked for them, and so they're very people. I think Joe Vandenbroek is really interesting. And he's probably not as well known, and their houses, and his wife Barbara, she was an architect and a landscape architect, wasn't
yes.
she? And I think actually when I was at university, some of the landscaping, Barbara was, had done some of the landscaping on the campus at UQ. Probably, I think, and they were a bit earlier, but they come into this period too. Lucas and Cummings, because some of those buildings they're still going after the war, aren't they? And probably as a practice, and it's a bit up and down, is Fulton, Trotter, Moss, whatever, Gilmore. I mean, they
the Tower Mill.
Yeah, well, you've got Fulton, and then you've got Trotter. So I think that and so there's some and they're probably we did have a nomination for a Trotter building which didn't go onto the register, but there's other better ones, I think, like the Tower Mill and things that should be, and that's one thing about this period is really poorly represented on lists and people, and it's very vulnerable.
And it's not popular.
It's not popular. People don't like it, and I find even with like Heritage Council, people, the decision makers, they all probably grew up with that stuff, and they think it's
well, like the executive building, for instance.
Yes.
I mean, is that a building with any credibility or integrity, or is it just to be removed? And the Pearl Assurance, I think, was a very competent sort of tall building. Hammerson, likewise. They're all still there.
Yes, but they're not.
But then they get done over.
And not very nicely, do they? I always and it's probably just slightly out. The Camelco building would be the 80s, wouldn't it? It's just slightly out of the.
Camelco being the AMP.
Well, it's
Blue
now
Tower.
Crown Law.
Oh, that one. Yes.
But it was an aluminium building,
yes.
And now it's completely done over, and you wouldn't know that it was an aluminium building,
Yes. Or the state, the taxation.
Yes.
building.
Well, it was kind of chipboarded or something.
It's worse.
And what about the buildings post 1975? Do you think?
What do I think? Post 9. Who do I think? What do I say?
Post 75. That's the last. Question.
The last question. I think not that I'm myself or was ever like when we were students we weren't great fans of Robin Gibson, but I do think that the cultural centre is something. The fact that it got built and it's all those pieces together and the time it was done, he's got it's got to be he's got to be sort of one of the main.
Well, it wasn't just that group of buildings, it was also the University of Queensland and Main Hall and the libraries.
And then they worked at the other, like thinking of where were the other major bits of work going on after the period is like that the expansion of the university. So like Griffith, like he did work at Griffith as well. And so, not that he would be one of my favourites, but I've got to say he's got, he's important.
Well, Seidler is here too.
Yes.
How do you relate those two?
What did we think about? Well, I suppose we get the first Seidler building we get is pretty boring, isn't it? It's the Hilton Hotel.
Which he never really acknowledges as being one of his buildings. But Riverside is sort of the one that he would point to.
And I mean, it certainly has. It's a classic, isn't it? It's got all the pieces. It's all his philosophies and thinking very well resolved and everything.
But then he did Coralbin here.
Yes, which. And then there are some flats down the Gold Coast and things from earlier periods which are...
Do you know where they are? I've seen pictures, but I have no idea where they are.
I think Don and Alice and I went looking for them once, and I thought we did find what we thought were something down at Currumbin Way, I think. And then I think in the more recent times, you'd have to say that people like Donovan Hill and their practice, and I suppose they're people who made the transition from doing the houses to the bigger buildings. Like in a way, Hayes and Scott didn't really transition very well, did they?
Neither did John Dalton.
No. So to the bigger work, whereas Donovan Hill did, and things like she probably doesn't get enough. I think Libby Watson Brown, and that house up at that house for her sister.
Dicky Beach.
We'll look back and see, and she was unfortunate the year that she did that house. She didn't win the house of the year because of some, I don't know, or there was something else, Flasher or something like. But I think she should have. And I suppose she's a friend of mine, but she's one of the women who's actually had her own practice and continued in practice and now made it, moving on to bigger scale work and everything. I think we'll look back and she'll be someone are you going to interview her? She just gets in.
Oh, then we should.
Yeah, because she started university in 1974, and in fact, I met her on the first day because we just had the floods, the 74 floods, and Ian Cinnamon decided that we were all going out and we're going to go around to all these poor people who'd been flooded and give them we had a questionnaire. We were to see how materials stood up in the flood and all that kind of thing. And we got paired with various people, and Libby and I got paired together. And we went around, with our clipboard asking these questions of people around near the Milton tennis court somewhere. And I remember we went to one house and knocked, and the lady came out and she said, and it turned out it was Paul Mimmett's grandmother. So we went in for a cup of tea, I think. So she's right at the end of the period. and she's just, things changed quite a bit because I think making universities free changed the composition of the students probably. Although most people had Commonwealth scholarships when I was there anyway. They seemed to be like everyone had a Commonwealth scholarship. So and probably to get into architecture you needed that, whatever score you needed meant you got a Commonwealth scholarship anyway. So
I think we're there.
Yeah.
Thank you.